Hi. Now you might think it fun being a literary agent, and it is. Obviously there's a lot of reading involved, and not just books, but sometimes letters from disappointed would-be clients, like Mr. Cobden, who wouldn't accept my polite letter of rejection without reply, and reply, and reply. A small selection of which I'd like to read you. Not just for the pleasure they afford me, but also I think from the valuable lessons we might all learn from a man of such prodigious talent. Well, here they are, the Cobden letters. Dear Mr. Jellicoe, that's me, by the way. I very much appreciate your polite letter of rejection concerning the first 3 chapters of my novel, The Grey Man. Your reasons, although not stated, were, I'm sure, entirely laudable. Indeed, I'll be the first to admit that I'm not your typical hack, and my style does require a little more concentration than your average Dan Brown or J.K. Rowling. After all, I have made an extensive study of literature pertaining to this green and pleasant land, and believe my words and thoughts very much capture a certain sillage, or whiff, if you will, of all those grand themes that made ours the most civilised literary tradition in the world. The Grey Man, my story of a librarian, was written, although you obviously disagree, very much with this in mind, and I thought my dissertation on various road maps hidden in his collection was not only entertaining, but scholarly. In sober retrospect, however, even I must admit that they are a little slow, and maybe do suffer from any lack of significant plot development, as you so pungently point out. So perhaps I won't hold your rejection of them against you. In the meantime, I've also posted a story to You Write On, a much esteemed site for new and aspiring writers to receive feedback on their efforts. However, to fully realise my true potential, I still consider myself in need of an agent. And as you are polite enough to write back to me, albeit with bad news, I feel that you feel that I might have a talent worth nurturing. Therefore, it is my intention to keep you informed of all that befalls me in my writing career, confident that you and I may soon arrive at some arrangement mutually beneficial to us both concerning the representation of my work to the wider world. Yours in confidence, Charles C. Cobden. I replied, and then he replied, Dear Mr. Jellicoe, the effrontery of it. I of course refer to the recent criticism my work received on that much esteemed website You Write On, of which I'm sure you're au fait. At first, considering the view expressed to be a joke, I was prepared to take it on the chin. After all, I of all people should be able to bear the slings and arrows of an outrageous yeoman, until of course he accuses me of pretension. That is when my gourd snaps. Pretentious? Moi? I have never met a less pretentious fellow than myself. But then I suppose it's not given to everyone to understand Laszlo's table of hierarchical needs, which I thought I'd so wittily woven into my tale. I suppose he's never heard of Plato's Republic either, which I also mercilessly scorned. Quel dommage. You may think that I should perhaps exude some sympathy with the poor clod's lack of education rather than opprobrium. And maybe I should, if he hadn't, in the next sentence, accused me of choosing to use long words simply to impress my readership. It was then that I found myself becoming finally discombobulated with his diatribe. All I can put it down to is jealousy of another writer who knows he has neither the hope nor the talent to compose sentences as elegant and as original as mine. Far from being discouraged, however, by such disfavour, I do intend to continue, and indeed redouble my efforts to achieve the breakthrough I feel I so thoroughly deserve. With this in mind, I've started upon my own Ulysses. Yes, Ulysses, a reply, if you will, to Joyce's rather lame effort set in Dublin. In my rendering of the myth, my hero, me, is taking a late night walk around Swindon, accompanied by the spirits of such late night luminaries as Dear Oscar and maybe GBS. In addition to the journey, I intend my narrative to encompass all the minor details of my life in the witty and trenchant style for which I'm hopefully becoming known. Of course, I shall refrain from profanities and any behaviour unbecoming of an English gentleman. But at the same time, I'll be casting laser-like a jaundiced eye over the behaviour of the proletariat whom I seem to already count in droves. It's a matter of some interest. I've always found Joyce somewhat non-judgmental in this regard. Indeed, it could be distilled from his narrative that he almost admired the uncouth utterances of Molly Bloom and the bourgeois desuetude of Stephen Dedalus. Not so I. I'm actually making it perfectly clear on which foot my boot is laced. Now, be that as it may, and as upset as I might be by the unfair treatment I received at the aforementioned keyboard critic, I shall endeavour to proceed beyond the 6 pages I've so far writ, and the 20 pages I've so far managed to read. It must be said that Joyce is not easy on the old grey cells in order to deliver within a year the completed manuscript, which I hope, with your assistance, would at last see me recognised as the just heir to Lawrence, Sterne, Dickens and Trollope. Yours, in confidence, Charles C. Cobden. I replied, and he replied. Dear Stanley, it is with some regret that I have to inform you that my planned masterpiece, provisionally entitled The English Ulysses, has been shelved temporarily in favour of myself pursuing a more dramatic work in the form of a play. Recently, I was unfortunate enough to witness a ghastly local production of that Beckett classic, Waiting for Godot. However, while it made absolutely no sense at all, none whatsoever, none of it, just a plethora of words in my humble opinion, it prompted the question, just who and what was Godot? Something I think even Mr. Beckett failed to consider. Well, I've considered it, and I'm currently writing a companion piece to answer that very question, in the hope that it might throw some light onto what Mr. Beckett was actually on about, and on about, and on about. There's nothing to be done, so he states in his opening fusillade. Nothing to be done, Mr. Beckett? I would have to disagree there. There's lots to be done. For instance, why not explain why some poor lunatic is dragged on stage by a rope and then forced to talk gibberish for 120 lines or so? This is to be done for a start, although being a man of eclectic tastes myself, I think I have rather figured that one out. You are here clearly alluding to the great Aleister Crowley, the Beast, 666, and the epic journey he made into the Sahara Desert, accompanied by the young poet Victor Newburgh, also tethered by a rope. His intention was to indulge in a bit of what is euphemistically called ritual magic before buggering poor Victor half to death. If that was your intention for Mr. Pozzo, as I suspect, and his poor acolyte, the somewhat distastefully named Lucky, then your play, I suggest, needs an urgent reappraisal in terms of its sexual politics for a start. With this in mind, Stanley, if I may now call you that, my companion piece, provisionally titled Goddo, so where is he then? Has this Goddo fellow waiting at a bus stop, reading the bus timetable and wondering why the bus hasn't come. I've tried to make it humorous, naturally, unlike Mr. Beckett, and included a number of stock comic character turns amongst those waiting with him. There's the dotty old widow who's about to miss her husband's funeral. There's a relief bus driver, a cheeky chappie in the mould of Reg Varney, and of course a ditzy blonde who every time she bends over expostulates, "Oh me booby, oh me boobies," sure to raise a laugh. In the end, Mr. Goddo, realising the bus isn't ever going to come, goes home, answering the question as to why those two tramps were left waiting for him in the first place. It's very much in the outline stage at the moment, but I think when completed, it could comprise a valuable addition to the canon of works already attributed to Crazy Sam himself. I know you're not in the business of placing plays with production companies. However, in this exceptional case, I hope you might be willing to broaden your portfolio. Yours, in confidence, Charles C. Cobden. I replied, and he replied, "Dear Stanley, I appreciate your reply concerning Beckett and my plans for a companion piece. You're right, it was an aberration. I was feeling particularly low on the day I wrote to you, and apologise for any offence I might have caused to you and your erstwhile relative. I had no idea. The happier news, however, is that I've now redoubled my efforts to complete the first chapter of my provisionally entitled The English Ulysses. It's been a hard slog because Swindon, as I'm sure you know, hasn't quite the same mythical qualities as Dublin on a wet afternoon. Sometimes, as I trudge its dreary streets, in search of colourful characters to write about, I hear Betjeman intoning his painful paean to Slough, and think perhaps that he might have got his towns confused, for if ever bombs were needed, of course, in such delicate times it's perhaps best not to pursue the thought, for fear of being labelled a terrorist sympathiser, but I'm sure you know where it was going. However, that having been said, back to my first chapter. Almost uncannily, as I'm beginning to describe my day in Swindon, I too, like Stephen Dedalus in the aforementioned, start with a shave. I clean my teeth and wash behind my ears before addressing the more pressing cause of nature, something I think Joyce carelessly forgets to mention, although I might be wrong. His writing is, after all, somewhat abstruse and open to interpretation. For some reason, his hero then dresses in funeral clothes, even though his mother's funeral was conducted the day before we meet him. And here is where we differ, because I would never wear funeral clothes the day after a funeral. I'd wear them on the day, but not the day after. Consequently, when I stride out, I'm wearing a smart pair of cavalry twills, a blue blazer, a white iron shirt, and brown sturdy shoes in respect of all the trudging I shall be doing. I also feature a decorative handkerchief in my top pocket to add an air of racy charm to my appearance. I plan on this taking no more than 50 pages to describe, before I then move on to my forensic examination of my thoughts, as I progress, with leisurely abandon, towards my garden gate. As it stands, however, and is actually written, I am at the moment in the process of applying soap to my face, prior to the application of the razor, so there is yet much more to come over the ensuing pages. So once again, let me apologise for any offence you might have gleaned concerning my reference to your relative, Crazy Sam, and hope together that we can still look forward to an exciting publishing future. Yours very sincerely, Charles C. Cobden. I replied, and he replied, Dear Stanley, thank you for your reply, and whilst I appreciate your concerns about detailed descriptions, I feel it only fair to point out that the great Thomas Hardy was also hoisted by that particular petard, but it did his career no harm. However, and in no way related to your kindly advice, I have yet again temporarily shelved my English Ulysses in favour of another idea that recently gatecrashed my thoughts. It occurred to me, while perusing my extensive library of literary giants, that the great English novel has yet to be written. Many attempts have been made, of course, but none have actually achieved that particular sobriquet. In America, they have Gatsby. Now, while I believe my English Ulysses will eventually achieve that status, the length of time it might take could prove somewhat prohibitive. So my thoughts have gone into overdrive and alighted upon an idea of creating an English Gatsby, a thin volume of no more than 120 pages detailing the triumphs and tragedies of love set in the glamorous world of horse racing. Sort of takes your breath away when you think about it, doesn't it? Jay, our UK Gatsby, has a string of racehorses and a huge house, all proceeds from his clandestine career as an international drug smuggler. Unmarried, he remains fixated on a girl he first met when she was 17. Let's call her Daisy for the sake of argument. So, to cut a short story even shorter, they meet again and he discovers to his horror that she's married to a brute called Tom. They all drink like fish, as you'd expect being wealthy, and it's while they're out drinking and driving, let this be a lesson to you, that Daisy accidentally runs over Tom's mistress, but Jay, being the misunderstood gentleman that he really is, takes the blame. What happens next? I haven't as yet quite decided, but I thought that in the first flush of my enthusiasm, I should write and perhaps appraise you of the plot so far. Maybe I had the husband of Tom's mistress come back and murder Jay in mistaken revenge. As I said, I'm a little undecided as to the ending yet, and perhaps could do with your input here, although I'm sure something will occur to me sooner rather than later. Here's hoping that you're as excited as I am at this surprise new development. I look forward to your thoughts. Yours, in anticipation, Charles C. Cobden. I replied, and he replied, Dear Stanley, nincompoop. Do I feel a nincompoop? Assuredly I do, rewriting Gatsby with the same plot as Gatsby, even using the same names. What was I thinking? Perhaps trudging around Swindon night after night in search of some colourful characters to include in my English Ulysses has eventually got to me. I hate to think what Joyce was thinking when he was similarly engaged, although no doubt it would have been his next pint of Guinness being that he was in Dublin. Anyway, maybe it's just as well that I've shelved that beast for the time being in favour of my next project, which I'm sure will be of interest to you. I'm already several pages in, and I'm really excited as to its potential. I think it could be a real money spinner. My life. They're always saying, write about what you know. Well, no one knows my life better than me, so why not write about me? After all, I've had some quite interesting adventures over the years. My story starts with my grandparents. I don't know much about them, so I've made a few things up. Poetic license, if you wish, like what they did and where they lived. Similarly with my parents. I didn't really know much about them either. They were just my parents. They were happily married, I think. And I was one of their 2 children. Dad worked in insurance and Mum stayed at home looking after my brother, who wasn't very well much of the time. I was sent to a boarding school, which might sound a bit draconian, but I enjoyed it, even if my academic endeavours left something to be desired. After my school days, for which I've already made notes, I planned to write about my life in London, where I wasn't quite down and out, but worked as a dishwasher for a couple of years in a hotel in Earl's Court. It was here that I began to put pen to paper, but it was only after I'd married and divorced and moved to Swindon that my literary prowess really began to bloom, and I knew that if it was to achieve its ultimate contentment, I needed to be published. Hence, I contacted you, Stanley. And the rest, I hope, will prove to be history. Oh, there is a funny bit when I lost my shoes on holiday, but that's all to come, and I look forward to you reading it. Yours with a wry smile, Charles C. Cobden. P.S. I've included 2 chapters for your perusal. I replied, and he replied. Dear Stanley, whilst I might agree that perhaps my life hasn't so far been all that it might have been in terms of entertainment value, I do take issue with your description of it as being spectacularly dull and bum-numbingly boring. As stated in your review of the 2 chapters I submitted for your approval. May I remind you, Stanley, that I have seen much of the world, albeit on television, in photographs and postcards. Incidentally, I have a postcard from Eritrea, showing a number of charming tribespeople in their native costumes, or lack of them. Splendid breasts, I must say, but they're beside the point. The point is that I'm not an insular fellow, as I'm sure you must appreciate. I know Swindon like the soles of my feet, and I spent many happy holidays on the coast. By the way, I was going to suggest that in order to promote my life, should you have thought it acceptable, you might consider devising an entry for me on Wikipedia. Just a couple of dozen lines or so on my background, my aspirations, including, of course, links to my publications I will no doubt have available in the future. I could, of course, write my own entry, but somehow I feel that would be cheating. So I would much prefer it if you, or any other of your successful writers, would do me the honour. I look forward with anticipation to your reply. Yours excited, Charles C. Cobden. I replied, and of course he replied. Dear Stanley, thank you for your speedy reply, and of course I do understand that your valuable time be better spent looking after the career of your authors rather than writing about them on Wikipedia. Indeed, I'm having second thoughts about the whole bloody idea myself. Perhaps Wikipedia isn't the way to go. After all, Joyce didn't need Wikipedia to make a success of his career, nor did Lawrence or Beckett, so why should I? Of course, I'm not yet in their company, but I aim soon to be, as I again take up the reins of my dream, the provisionally titled The English Ulysses. I know I've toyed with many other projects since its commencement and provisional retirements, but somehow I seem drawn back to those thoughts I have between leaving the house and arriving at the garden gate. I feel they need expansion and resolution before I move on to my planned pavement soliloquy, as I saunter at a leisurely pace towards Swindon, or in the words of my hero, Troikia, that wet and windless gallery of ghostian carnage and cultural haberdashery. That should give Sparks Notes something to wrestle with. You'll note the inspired triumvirate of Troy and IKEA. In other words, the eternal and the temporal brought together to convey the mythical. The Swindon I wish to render a city of ghosts, forlorn hopes, and daffodils desiccated beneath the weight of technological disinnovation. Very Joyce, I'm sure you'd agree, Stanley. If you're wondering where I come across such apposite phrasing, I have to admit I borrowed it from another project I was toying with, but have decided to temporarily shelve in favour of present matters. Inspired by that old rogue Nabokov, I have been planning a book similar, but not exactly, remember the British Gatsby, I do, oops, to his notorious tale of a forbidden love between a middle-aged gentleman and a charming young neophyte named Lolita, a girl of 12, I believe. Saucy? I should cocoa, and a little bit illegal. Probably wouldn't muster these days, so I thought I might reinvent the story with my heroine Lulu being 18 and her middle-aged lover Nigel being no more than 30. That ought to fix it, I think. Having killed her mother, they run away together and end up in Swindon Travelodge, where she meets someone else and leaves poor old Nigel, not Humbert, for goodness sake, what sort of name was that, crying into his cup of shame. I think it has merit, and I will endeavour to finish it once I've finally put the English Ulysses to bed. Your input on matters is always gratefully received, Stanley, so please, if you have any advice on these ideas, or on any of the above, I'd very much appreciate receiving them. Yours, Buzzing, Charles C. Cobden. I replied, and of course he replied, Dear Stanley, as much as I value your input, I think sometimes you input just too much negativity concerning my projects. For a start, you've called my English Ulysses a non-starter, when indeed I have started it. 15 pages written and over 40 pages read. You think my Lulu to be ludicrous and entirely missing the point of Lolita. And as for my play, well, less said soonest mended, Stanley. I'm beginning to get the feeling that you have little faith in my literary prowess. Well, let me reassure you, I will not let this pen rest in my hand until Jerusalem has been builded here amongst the dark, satanic quills. A neat turn of phrase. I'm sure even you would have to agree. Let me assure you that I do understand your frustration at my lack of continuity. However, I'm sure I don't need to remind you that was it not the great Leonardo da Vinci himself who had the greatest difficulty finishing off any of his masterworks? Was not the Mona Lisa dragged halfway across Italy before the final brushstrokes were applied some 10 years later, to say nothing of the Last Supper? Did he not then frustrate his benefactors and cause them to lose faith? Provenance, Stanley. Provenance and patience, I beg you, because recently I've been considering writing an epic poem. Now I know the market for poetry is small, but I believe such seminal works as Paradise Lost, Beowulf and Childe Harold still sell in bucket loads, especially when they're on the A-level syllabus at our educational establishments. With this in mind, Stanley, I've begun to weave a few words together concerning the plight of mankind in these perilous times. Provisionally titled Achilles, the poem will take the form of a conversation between Herodotus, the writer of history, and Morpheus, the god of dreams. Am I qualified to write such a lofty opus, I hear you say? The answer is yes, of course I'm qualified. My knowledge of the classics, thanks to Wikipedia, YouTube and other authoritative sites, is quite extensive, whilst my interest in current affairs is second to none. Put the two together, Stanley, and Alfred Lorne Tennyson, that's a Joycean joke by the way, his legacy will live on in me. As a matter of interest, did you know that Alfred also wrote Ulysses? Maybe that's why Joyce had a pop at him. What do you think? Anyway, I'll leave it with you, Stanley, and look forward to hearing from you at your own convenience. Ye timeless beastie of incorrigible incognizance. Achilles, verse 1, line 4. Yours indoors, Chelsea Cobden, I replied. And he replied, Dear Stanley, there are few more thankless tasks in this world than being a writer without appreciation. Admittedly, I do have 3 decent reviews and a couple of stars on You Write On, but somehow it's just not enough. So your comments on my plans to write an epic poem weren't received quite in the humorous manner in which I'm sure they were intended. For example, there was a young man called Achilles who enjoyed gentlemen's willies. It was not part of my grand plan. Whilst it would have made you snigger. In writing it, I frankly found it rather offensive. Indeed, I believe any scholar of the ancients would be equally unimpressed. I myself don't of course pretend to be a scholar, despite what I consider to be a scholarly pursuit. However, sadly it's not to be, at least not for the moment, because I really do have some exciting news. Nay, more than exciting, important news which I'm sure will send shockwaves around the world. So hang on to your hat, Stanley, when I tell you it's been recently asserted that a relative of mine, certainly a Cobden, was married to none other than Jack the Ripper. Can you believe that? Fair takes a breath away, doesn't it? Imagine it, my great-aunt or great-cousin being married to a man like that, if that man actually was Jack the Ripper. I'm still in shock, as no doubt you are. Me, a humble wordsmith, being related to such a monster, at least by marriage. Dumbfounded, I should cocoa. Of course, as you would expect, I shall be diarising, not a word I'm particularly keen on, but can think of no other, any investigations with a view to you, as agent, presenting my findings to the world. I feel there could be a good deal in this for both of us, Stanley, and look forward to your negotiations with publishers, who undoubtedly will be beating a tattoo to your door on receipt of such sensational news. You're in shock, Charles Cobden, I replied, and he replied, Dear Stanley, as you no doubt suspected, but were too polite to divulge, the Ripper, as named in the assertion, was indeed the unlikeliest of suspects, and most likely not a suspect at all. Those who studied the case assure me that the man named was probably not in London at the time, but in France, in Dieppe in fact. The Cobden mentioned, a Jane I believe, has nothing shared with me but a name. Oh, disappointed? Yes. relieved also. After all, to be related to such a beast, even by marriage, could have tainted the reputation I still hoped to achieve amongst the literary establishment. With this in mind, Stanley, I've immersed myself in 2 projects of late, which I think, or at least hope, will be of interest to you. First and foremost, Jack the Kipper, a children's story very much inspired by recent events, although Jack is a fish and not a murderer of prostitutes, which probably wouldn't go down too well with the children. As I mentioned, in my life, I used to have a goldfish when living in a bedsit, so fish and their antics aren't a mystery to me. Always write about what you know. And as for children, well, I was a child once, and I know what I enjoyed. Secondly, I've restarted what you termed a non-starter, my English Ulysses, but not with any great hope of finishing it in the near future. It's a massive undertaking, I now realise. However, I just can't bear to see the 30 pages or so I've written and the 60 pages I've now read go to waste. Although I do have to say that Joyce, God bless him, must have been pretty drunk when he wrote most of it, because much of it really doesn't make much sense. Of course, I shall avoid all such temptations. My Ulysses will make perfect sense and of course contain nothing of a questionable nature, such as coarse language or immoral acts. I really can't imagine the citizens of Swindon being quite so depraved as the citizens of Dublin, as depicted by the author. As for Molly Bloom's famously rude exposition towards the end of the work, which I've already read out of sequence, well, words fail me. Pornography is too wholesome a word for it. I'm surprised that such a vile testimony was ever allowed into print. I suspect Joyce must have been well out of his tree when he wrote it, and probably forgot he was there until reminded of it in court, and the work was judged obscene and promptly banned. Something of a shock, wouldn't you agree, Stanley? I know I'd be shocked if something I'd written was considered too rude for public consumption, but of course, that would never be the case, as I consider myself a family-friendly author, very much in the tradition of Dickens, Trollope and Fielding. Although I must confess in my reading, I do have some regard for the racier side of literary achievement, inasmuch I still enjoy a Howard Robbins or the odd Mickey Splain. However, as much as I appreciate them, I've never let them influence my style. As a children's author, it would be inappropriate, whilst as an author catering for a more informed audience, it would be a little too colloquial. On that note, Stanley, I look forward to hearing your echo, if I may put it as such. As you know, I value your opinion greatly, and look forward to it as soon as it is convenient for you to express it. Yours, hopefully, Charles C. Cobden. I replied, with some good news at last, and he replied, Dear Stanley, I can't tell you how flattered I am that you should have found a publisher for our correspondence. I'm going to be published. Have you any idea how that makes me feel? Having a story with a handful of reviews on You Write On cannot in any way compare to the thought of my words on paper being between covers and a dust jacket, available at all good bookshops. You haven't only made my days, Stanley, you've made my life. I understand my remuneration will be minimal at this stage, but as you know, I don't write for money. My reward is of a far more profound nature. I have achieved little in my life, for which I'm proud. I have no wife and no children. Even my accommodation is substantially subsidised, so to hear I'm to be published is to hear God and all his angels sing at last. Charles C. Cobden, available in all good bookshops now. A published author, a man of letters indeed. Sort of takes your breath away, doesn't it? My thanks and admiration for you, Stanley, knows no bounds. Your humble servant, Charles C. Cobden. P.S. I trust the publisher, more associated with cheap comic novels and gift books, I believe, has a more scholarly imprint in which to feature our stimulating and, I must say, often erudite communications. I let the publisher reply. And here endeth the Cobden letters. I do hope they've given you as much pleasure as they've given me. Oh, and don't worry about Mr. Cobden. I hear he's moved on from letter writing and is currently reworking War and Peace, replacing the complicated names with something a little more user-friendly. Apparently, he's reached page 15.